When it comes to financial advice, however, we're in the early WebMD days right now, right? We're in the early Google Maps days. You remember when we used to use GPS and it would take us on weird routes, places that you're like, I'm going to die in the wilderness if I follow this route. It's kind of like the TV show The Office when they follow the GPS right into the lake. That's where we are with ChatGPT and AI right now, is that if you actually start to listen for financial advice from ChatGPT, all it's doing is just aggregating all this information from Google.
Welcome back to Pending and Trending. I'm here today with Chris Miles. He is the founder of Money Ripples, author of Work Optional Blueprint, and host of the Money Ripples podcast. A former financial advisor, he's known for his approach to building passive income outside traditional Wall Street strategies. Thanks for being on today, Chris. I'm so happy to have you.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Deidre.
Okay, so what made you leave your traditional finance, like Wall Street position? You were a financial advisor. What made you leave that and do what you're doing now? Be almost an anti-financial advisor, is that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I probably drank the Kool-Aid for a good 4 years straight as a financial advisor. I mean, I was in my mid-20s and I thought, hey, you know what? If I just keep, stashing money away for years, set it and forget it, and in decades I'll retire a millionaire, just like I told all my other clients, right? And then I had an awakening when my dad reached out to me and he said, well, Chris, when are you going to advise me? Now, my dad at this time was 61 years old, and he'd already had heart attacks and strokes by his 40s and 50s. And he just said, listen, Chris, the work of my job, the stress of my job is going to kill me. I just know it. So what can I do to get out? So I go to sit down with him and understand my dad was a penny pinching saver. This guy was like the role model that Dave Ramsey would look up to, right? That kind of guy. I mean, he bought everything on sale. The guy never wanted debt. I mean, this guy paid for cash for everything. He was post-Depression era kind of mentality. Well, I sit down with him, and this is in 2005, at the end of 2005. I'm sitting down with him. I'm looking at all of his numbers and everything, and I notice he's debt-free, including his mortgage. He's been packing money away in his company's 401k plan, getting the company match like every good boy should. And despite all of that, I had to tell him, I said, Dad, if you were to retire today, you would have to die in about 5 or 6 years because you're going to run out of money. He said, well, that's not what I wanted to hear. I'm like, well, that's not what I wanted to say. Right? And so he's like, well, what do I do? I said, I don't know. Work longer, save more. I mean, that's about it. I'm like, you got this paid off house, but you can't cash that out, put in the stock market. It's illegal to borrow money and invest it in mutual funds and such. So I don't know. Yeah, and even then I wouldn't trust it because what if the market goes down? Then I lost all of his money and all his security, right? So I'd had no answers for him. And I walked away very frustrated. And it was just a month later, I decided to reach out to a friend of mine who I trained to be a financial advisor on my team, but then he quit to go do real estate investing. So I thought for certain, you know what, this guy probably went broke trying to do his real estate dream. He'll probably want to come back to work for me. So I called him up to wish him Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. It was right that week in between. And as I did that, I was like, well, how are things going? He's like, Chris, my life's amazing right now. He's like, my dad and I have partnered on some real estate deals, and we've now doubled his income as a professor at the local university. I said, wait, come on. How is that possible? Like that you've only been doing this for 5 months. That's too good to be true, right? And we kind of have this debate back and forth about what's better, stocks or real estate. And then finally he just stops me. He said, Chris, how many of your clients are truly financially free where they don't worry about money? I said, well, they all worry about money. They all worry about running out of it too soon. Okay, how about this? How many of you guys as financial advisors are financially free, not off the commissions you're earning, but actually doing these investments? And I thought about it, and there's guys that I know in my office that have been working there since the 1970s. And I said, well, they don't seem to be quitting anytime soon, so maybe none? There's your problem. Okay, well, give me the answer. It's like, I won't give you the answer because you just got done arguing with me that stocks were better than real estate. I said, well, listen, I'm open. Give me something here. He's like, all right, fine. Go get the book, Who Took My Money by Robert Kiyosaki, which is a lesser known Rich Dad, Poor Dad book that tells you mutual funds suck. There you go. Saved you 3 hours audiobook there. and then he's like, and then listen to this AM talk radio show with these two real estate investors. And so I did. And after a couple months of listening to them, I went to one of their live events. that they put on a local hotel. And finally, after a while, I said, I can't do this anymore. Either I stay on, I put blinders on, and I just keep working because that's what my paycheck says to do, or I quit. And so I chose the latter. I quit. I vowed never to teach about money again. I would just be a mortgage broker, and I would teach ballroom dancing on the side. And that's what I was doing. And that was in 2006. Now, of course, I wanted to learn what these guys were doing. So eventually I started doing things with real estate, turned my starter home into a rental, actually sold it to an investor at full appraisal, leased it back, and then subleased it so I can make rental income while stripping out all the equity too. So I did that, right? And so long story short, by the next summer, before I was 28, almost 29 years old, I had enough passive income coming in that I was literally what I call work optional, where I had enough passive income to work because I want to, not because I had to. And that was a shocker, because I thought for certain that I would have to work at least into my 40s, slaving and saving away, right? Both slave and save, into these retirement plans, or not even retirement plans, mutual funds, because if I want to do it in my 40s, you can't put it into a 401k and IRA. I get slapped with penalties and taxes if I take it out too early, right? So I thought if I'm lucky enough to save a couple $1 million by my 40s, I can retire. Yet here I am in my late 20s, and I didn't even have to have millions of dollars because I realized it was about income and cash flow. It's about acceleration of your money and creating passive income versus just, accumulating a lot of money and living on less than the interest. And that's pretty much what, when all of a sudden I'm this retired 28, 29-year-old kid, I think of a kid when I look back, and I think, my goodness, like that was, people, it's just like, it's crazy. And so people thought it was crazy too. They were like, how did you do it? What did you do? And so finally in 2007, I came out of retirement to teach people how I did it. And then the recession kicked my butt. I actually went over $1 million in debt. Even though I was financially independent, I went financially broke and literally on welfare, food stamps. I had to dig out of that hole, and eventually avoided bankruptcy, but paid off all that debt and got myself to the point where I was financially independent the second time at December 2016. And that's when I realized, like, okay, I did it again, but this time I'm smarter, I'm wiser, I'm not going to lose it. So that's kind of my story. That's where I've been helping people do it ever since, is helping them do the same thing I did, which is what I refer to as the work optional blueprint.
So I love the work optional term. I think that's a great term because many of us don't want to retire anytime soon, but work optional is kind of fun, right? Like that's a great term for that. And what an awakening that you went through during that process. And I'm really excited and this all ties in with a lot of the people that I speak to on my podcast and investing, and it's also tying into many of the books that I'm reading as well. So one happens to be, hold on, it's right behind me here. Why the Rich Are Getting Richer is what I'm actually reading now, which is another one of Robert Kiyosaki's. So how do you help clients? I mean, I feel like it's the norm for so many high income people that, okay, well, you know what? They put money into their 401k, they max that, their company might match, they might not, but they're growing this 401k. And then, if you, at some point in your life, you start to watch that 401k and sometimes it's gaining for you, losing for you. So how do you help them escape that? And and how do you partner with them to do that? Or what does that look like? And then how do you get them into vehicles outside of Wall Street?
Yeah, this is a conversation we have daily, with people that are reaching out, because there are a lot of people that make good income and even have decent net worth, and then find out that net worth is worth less.
Yeah.
Because net worth doesn't pay the bills, Now, granted, having a lot of savings, you could say, well, yeah, I kind of pay the bills, but we've always been taught, and really, I would say brainwashed, right? We've been indoctrinated by financial firms, the big companies that obviously pay for all the ads. They pay for all the financial advisors to tell you what to do, the financial experts, right? These are the Merrill Lynch's and the Goldman Sachs of the world that say, listen, just trust us, turn your money over to us. In fact, when I was a financial advisor, they would say to all of us, not just Chris, but everybody, they'd say, remember the 3 T's, that your clients lack the time, the training, and the temperament to do their own investing. Therefore, they should just trust you and literally just turn their money over to you, right? And that's when I realized, I'm like, I'm just a salesman in a suit is what I am. And so we got to break people away from believing that, one, that investing is just Wall Street, because it's certainly not. The richest people in the world use hedge funds, often not even going into Wall Street. They're going into things that we talk about here on this podcast, alternative investments, whether it be oil and gas, gold and silver, real estate of various forms, private equity and things like that. They're doing all those things. They've already been doing it. However, we've been taught you just go into that S&P 500 index, right? And just turn your brain off. Even Warren Buffett said so. That's the best place for the average investor to go into. No, that's the best place for somebody who wants to turn their brain off and do nothing. He's like, well, this is better than nothing. Right. And that's what we've been brainwashed to believe, right? And so with our clients, the people that come to us, they realize, they're saying, listen, I've got net worth. Sometimes it's net worth of a few $100,000. Sometimes it's into the millions, and they come to us because it's the same problem. They'll say, okay, I've been saving money. I've been doing a good job here according to the standards that have been set, much like my own father, right? But I just don't see an end in sight. To give you an example, I had a guy reach out just a few months ago. He had 1.9 million saved in his 401k. So just so you understand, that's big, because the statistics don't support making that much money in your 401ks and IRAs. For example, Fidelity, they've got about 45 to 50 million clients right now. Of those, only about 1.1 million of these people have over $1 million. So think about it, that's just a little over 2 or 3%. I can guarantee you that Fidelity's clientele, their demographic, is more than about 2% baby boomers and older Gen Xers.
Right.
Guaranteed. Right? So these are people that have been proven that they actually are saving money. These aren't the people that Dave Ramsey talked about that are just blowing money and spending, because they won't save in retirement plans. These are people that are actually savers. And of that percentage of savers, only 2.5% have at least $1 million. But if you go off of the actual industry standards, they tell you should only pull off, if you're in your 60s, 3% a year. So you do the math. If you were lucky enough to have $1 million, you're only supposed to live on $30,000 a year. Below the poverty line, you're literally a broke millionaire. And that's what we've been taught. And so with this guy, he's got 1.9 million. I'm saying, well, congratulations, you're in the top 1 to 2% of savers right now. By the way, of Fidelity, like I said, 1.1 million, it's actually 1.15 million to be exact, or have over $1 million. But Transamerica did their own study and discovered that 35% of these same people believe it'll take a miracle to be able to retire. Why? Because they actually realized, like, I can't live on 3%. They will need at least $2, $3, $4 million to live on a decent income, a comfortable income, right? And so this guy, 1.9 million, he said, Chris, my financial advisor at Vanguard won't even tell me how I can retire. And I said, well, either one, he doesn't know, or two, he's scared to tell you the answer. Because I'm like, you got 1.9 million. What do you want to live on per year? 200,000 a year. Okay, well, if you want to live on 200,000 a year, based on you being, 59 and a half is what he just turned. That's why he's really wondering, because he's like, now I can pull out this money without penalty. Can I retire? And no one will tell him he can retire because he doesn't have enough. Because he would have to have $6.7 million saved up to pull off the 3%, which is $200,000 a year. But at his current balance, he can pull off less than $60,000 a year.
Right.
No wonder people are begging for Social Security, because they can't make it without it. In fact, that's what all the stats say, is that ultimately these retirement plans have failed. And so I told him, I said, the reason he won't tell you is because if he did happen to know the answer, it would be depressing, because you would have to somehow more than triple your money in the next 10 years. And even then, what the market goes down, like, does that mean you have to do all the heavy lifting by putting more money in because the market's not going up? Which Vanguard, same advisor, by the way, only predicts a 2.8 to 4.8% average return for the next 10 years. That's their optimistic viewpoint. So basically they're saying you probably be better to keep your money in a CD, is what they're saying, right? So I told him, I said, listen, like, the truth is, like, you might have to work until you're at least 70, and that's if the market smiles on you the right way. He's like, Chris, I don't mind working until I'm 70. I just won't have to do it. And I said, here's the difference, though. And this is the big mindset shift that has to happen with all of our clients that we work with, because we do one-on-one coaching with these people and help them strategize and connect them with deals. We don't raise any capital ourselves. We don't do any of the investing. We're not investment advisors. We're more strategists and connectors. And so I said, here's the deal. You've got 1.9 million. Now, there are investments that, even in our network, on the low end, usually pay about 10% a year. So what's 10% of 1.9 million? He said 190,000. I'm like, that's right, $190,000 per year. Your goal, $200,000. So already you have enough to actually be able to retire right now. Even though the Vanguard advisors say, you got to at least 3.5 times your money to be able to retire. He's like, okay, that's better. I was like, well, that's not all. Because looking at some of these other aspects of your finances, I noticed you have a rental property. He said, yeah, I do. It's paying me $300 a month. He's like, in fact, that's the only income I'm making right now. And I said, well, that's great. But that $300 a month is coming from a house that has $800,000 of equity. I said, that's a horrible return on your equity. In fact, if you could sell this house, put it in a CD and make more money than this right now. I said, or we could sell this house. You can pull out the equity. You can even transfer it to another place. But let's just say that you sell it, pull out the equity, and maybe you only walk away with $700,000 after fees. $700,000 at 10%, what are you making per year? $70,000 a year, right? Take your $70,000, add it to $190,000. You've got $260,000. That's over $250,000 a year that you could be making this year, or just wait another 10 years and see if you might be able to make it. And that's the big shift, right? Is going from the accumulation theory to an acceleration mindset or strategy. Is how do we turn this into actual income? I had another guy that ended up listening to my Money Ripples podcast, and he went to his financial advisor. He had $1 million saved up, and the financial advisor says you can live on $30,000 a year. He says, no thanks. I live in California. Homeless people live on $30,000 a year. And so when he did that, we end up helped setting up with strategies. He ended up buying a couple of duplexes that were turnkey properties where somebody else actually managed the properties. He got into some oil and gas investments, some apartment deals. The next thing you know, his income went from what should have been $30,000 a year to over $130,000 a year. And that's really what we try to help people really open their eyes and seeing is that, no, you don't have to follow that mainstream, old beaten path. There is a road less traveled, although not untraveled, traveled by literally millions of us that have done the same thing. But we're not the financial advisor. We're not paid a commission to tell you to go put your money in these places. So that's the big thing that we do is we're working with clients is helping them figure out how we find and free up cash, how do we save money on taxes, how do we, even if you have debt, can we pay off debt more strategically and different than what they teach you and stuff, and help improve your cash flow, and at the same time take your net worth and get it to actually generate passive income. So now you don't worry about compounding interest. You now worry about how do I compound income? Because even if you can't make it in the first year, I had somebody who they actually made about $60,000 in their first year of passive income, but their goal was about $75,000. Well, the cool thing is the next year you reinvest that $60,000, adds another $6,000 a year. Now you're at $66,000. You do it again in 3 years, they're at their goal, right? So it's things like that. It's compounding income versus compounding interest. That's really the big mindset shift we have to get people out of, is break free from that stale old slave and save Wall Street advice.
So my understanding from what you're saying is that you help people geared towards cash flow as opposed to just appreciation, right? And not just putting their money in Wall Street, but help them with their cash flow so that they are actually bringing in what they want to bring in every year. So that's where the work optional piece comes in. So do I have that right? Can you?
Bingo. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. And then you can, through your program, you can help people reach that in, say, a 5-year period?
It depends. Yeah. I mean, some people, like you've heard, like some of these people are like, we can do it within a year. Other people might be 10 plus years. Typically it's 10 years or less for the people that we have. For example, we generally require, especially if we want them to diversify a little bit, we generally require they have at least $200,000 that's potentially investable cash. It could be money in old 401ks or IRAs or Roth IRAs or sitting in savings. It could be money that's equity trapped in properties. For example, I had a woman that she has a farm and she came to one of our mastermind events. She hadn't joined yet. She was the only one that hadn't joined. So she was kind of uncomfortable because she said, Chris, I'm not as rich as all these other people here. Like some of these people are worth millions of dollars or they make really good income. We make a pretty modest income living in the middle of nowhere. And I said, but what do you need per month to live? She's like, I only need really like $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year. I said, here's what's interesting is that a lot of our clients usually want at least $10,000, $20,000, sometimes $30,000 a month of passive income, but you only need $5,000. I was like, you may not have a lot of cash to sitting around, but you've got equity on your farm, right? Like, are you planning to keep this farm forever? Are you planning to sell off pieces of it? What do you plan to do? She's like, actually, we were considering selling parts of it because we don't want to keep it forever. I was like, great. Because even if we sell, say, $600,000 of property, that can be invested and it generates $60,000 a year at 10%, that's literally got you financially free within a year. I'm like, even if it was $500,000, it would still take a couple years to get there. But still, you can get there pretty quickly. In fact, faster than some of these people that want 20 grand a month that have a lot of money sitting around. And I think that's the big shocker, is that people don't realize that. That's why I tell people that net worth is kind of worth less than passive income or cash flow, right? That's why you need to have your money working for you that way and reversing it. So yeah, it's really interesting to see because it's different. Some people, they only have 200,000, they want to get to 10,000 a month. I mean, and they're not, say they're saving $10,000 a year. It might take them 10 to 15 years, but that is a whole lot better than the alternative, which is save $10,000 a year in your retirement plan and maybe never getting there, right? So it's really just shaving off decades of whatever their path they were on. It's saving them literally decades of their life that they could have back. By the way, I was sharing that story about the guy that had $1 million, right? What's interesting is that he did actually become financially independent, having 130,000 a year instead of just 30,000 a year coming in. He became financially independent when he was 60. And just last year, he was 64 years old. His friend texted me, he says, Chris, I want to let you know that Dan, who was his name, it's like Dan actually passed away of a heart attack this week. He was sitting at his desk, just minding his business, and then he just died of a heart attack and he was gone. And he said, I just want to let you know that even though you and Dan would only talk from time to time, because he was already done with the plan, like we were just putting in motion at this point, right? So we weren't having to talk all the time. He says, just so you know, even though you guys weren't always talking every single day or anything like that, he loved you. Like, he really was grateful for what you gave him, because for that reason, like, he was able to, do things that he wanted to do for those last 4 years of his life. He was able to take his kids and take his sons with him to some of these investment events to teach them a different path than what he learned. He's like, guys, you'll save yourself so much hassle and pain if you learn this instead, right? And so he's like, he really did really appreciate it. And I think for me, I appreciated hearing that, because the fact that I knew that we gave him 4 years, his last 4 years of his life back, versus him saying, well, my financial advisor says I can only live on $30,000 a year on my $1 million. I guess I'll just keep working, right? And so that's where I'm grateful that it can give people that time back, because that's the one thing we can't ever get back.
That's for sure. That's for sure. You can't get time back. And what a nice testament to what you do to be able to help people through that wealth building journey and live financially free for that time that he had anyway, right?
Right.
We want to talk a little bit about AI just because it's all the buzz, and
Yeah.
how, I know everyone's focusing on AI right now. I mean, I've done a ton with AI as well and some coaching with that. How do you see the marketplace shifting towards or pivoting away from AI? And give us your thoughts around that.
Yeah. Aside from AI and using that for, quicker and faster calculations and, aggregating knowledge and things like that, awesome. I love AI for that reason. I mean, it's great. When it comes to financial advice, however, we're basically in the early web. Let me say that again. That's a tongue twister. We're in the early WebMD days right now, right? We're in the early Google Maps days. You remember when we used to use GPS and it would take us on weird routes, places that you're like, I'm going to die in the wilderness if I follow this route. It's kind of like the TV show The Office when they follow the GPS right into the lake, That's where we are with ChatGPT and AI right now, is that if you actually start to listen for financial advice from ChatGPT, all it's doing is just aggregating all this information from Google. And so so think about this. I said earlier about Fidelity stats. The majority of people are following the same old, set it and forget it, slave away, put it in your 401k, get your company match, and all this other kind of advice for decades, and it hasn't worked yet. I mean, literally, the 401k plan became available for middle America in 1985. Guys, that was over 40 years ago. It should have worked by now, and it hasn't. Because, well, even if you get the company match, the problem is that long term, it only adds about 2 or 3% a year on your overall return because of how compounding numbers work. You only get double the number if you get the 100% match, if you get up there, at the end. The problem is that there's also high excessive fees that are usually between 1% and 2%. And speaking of Fidelity, their fund actually underperformed the last 10 years of the stock market by 2.1%. So you factor in the 0.75% fees plus the 2.1%, bad return, or lack of returns compared to the stock market. You put those together, the match just made up for the bad performance and the excessive fees. You have been better off investing on your own. and people don't realize that because, again, you ask ChatGPT, they're going to tell you just do up to your company match and then put your money in a Roth IRA. And I know I've done podcast episodes using AI to say, what can I do if I want to retire by the time I'm 45? And the crazy thing, it'll say, put your money in the company match and do this and this. And it's like, yeah, and then I'll have to ask it because you have to think critically with ChatGPT. You have to ask it like, wait a minute, but I want to retire at 45. If I put my money in a 401k or even my Roth, I have to wait till I'm 59 and a half, right? So isn't that the wrong vehicle? You're right. It is the wrong vehicle. Well, why didn't you tell me that in the first place? Come on, you just drove me into a freaking lake, And that's what I'm seeing happening is that people don't think critically. And maybe it's because I'm a Gen Xer. We don't believe anyone. So we don't believe chat. We don't believe anybody, right? So for that reason, maybe that's why I do that. But that's the thing. I've pushed it, even on my own podcast episodes. And the sad thing is that even when I push it, I'll finally get to admit, oh yeah, real estate investing is better. But I have to push and question it completely to get to that point. By the way, even when I said, hey, I want to retire in 20 years, I'm 25, I want to retire at 45, how much do I have to save? And I said, I make $100,000 a year and I want to live on $100,000 a year. Do you know what it told me? It said I have to save $61,000 a year of my income. But it said, wait a minute, but you have to pay tax on that $100,000. So really you have to live on probably $18,000 or $19,000 a year to be able to meet your goal in 20 years, right? And there's people that literally believe they can do the whole FIRE movement, which is financially independent, retire early. And I know this because I was on their Facebook group page for a while. And then I noticed that they were all trying to fit themselves like the square peg in a round hole. They were all trying to do the traditional, put your money in the S&P 500, live dirt cheap, and then eventually you can live on the 4%. The 4% rule, right? Here's the problem. The 4% rule was debunked years ago. The 4% rule was developed by a guy who was a financial advisor that looked at 1926 to 1976, that 50-year period, and figured out how much can I pull out and not lose everything. Well, guess what? Well, that 50-year period, there's a few things that changed since then in the last literally 50 years. People live longer, right? And then two, inflation is higher because 1971 is when Nixon took us off the gold standard, right? But it was implemented by about 73, 74. So at the tail end, we finally got to that point where we had this massive inflation because we no longer had the gold standard keeping us in check a little bit. So we have higher inflation, longer life. That's why even the experts say, yeah, if you're in your 60s, 3%. Only 4% if you're in your 70s. And so these people that are trying to retire before they're 40, I said, or by the time they're 40, I was like, well, this should be a 2% rule for you guys because, and in fact, I even used ChatGPT to back it up and they even said it was right. And that's using ChatGPT, come on. But they said it should only be 2%. And I actually got ousted out of the group, even though I was one of the only people in that group that actually became FIRE, financially independent, retire early, twice by the time I was 39, right? Because I did it the first time in 2006, and then I went broke, and then had to dig out of that $1 million debt hole, and then do it again at the end of 2016. So that's the crazy part, is that everybody's like teaching all this crap out there, and that's the thing. You go to ChatGPT, if you ask about FIRE movement, they'll just teach the same old, dogma that these people are teaching without any question if it's valid or not. And I think you're going to notice in the next few years, they're kind of moving towards ChatGPT to be their therapist and to be their financial advisor and everything else. I think in the next few years, you're going to see so many people get burned by following that advice. They're going to say, oh, this is like WebMD. I can't just trust this. I actually need a doctor. And then I think they'll shift back in the next year or two.
That's so interesting that you say that because I do remember WebMD very well. That was the go-to for every medical thing that you had, right? And yeah, ChatGPT often doesn't give the advice that there's a lot out there talking about how students use it as a therapist and all of those things, and they're not always getting the advice that is in their best interest. So super interesting, that take on that. So what is the single move that would be in an investor's best interest today for them to stop working for money and have the optional plan that you talk about.
Yeah, my book, there's like really three phases you kind of go through, or three steps. It's get lean, get liquid, and get out. So get lean means you start to track your money, be a wise steward of your money. Isn't it interesting that every financial expert out there teaches you to be a saver, right? They teach you to avoid debt and just keep saving and hoarding money. It's almost like the squirrel that's that's trying to save the nuts for winter. And in case that winter of retirement's too long, you got to keep saving more nuts, right? And you never know how many nuts are going to be enough, because you never know how long your winter's going to be of retirement. And that saver mentality, that I like, much like the scarcity Dave Ramsey type of mentality, right, is always been about just no debt, save. But remember, my dad did that. My dad was the penny pinching saver, and yet I had to tell him, Dad, you got 5-6 years to live on, even in your 60s after being a great saver. And so the savers live in scarcity. Spenders also live in scarcity, because spenders, that's easy come, easy go. They focus on income but ignore expenses. Savers ignore their income but focus, in fact, they fixate on expenses, right? But a steward looks at both sides of the equation. They realize that how can I maximize income while also being wise manager of my expenses? And I never tell people to live on a budget, because I hate the word budget anyways. I call it a spending plan. How do you spend money in a wise way? How do you prioritize your spending in a way that suits you? Because the truth is that what might be a waste of money for one person may not be a waste of money for you. That gym membership I might find for people is a waste of money, versus others, they actually use it and it creates a greater quality of life, and they become better income producers as a result, right? Because of better health and less sick and less, lost income as a result. So there's a lot of things that can be factored there based on how are you as that steward of your money. And so I teach them a more abundant perspective to be a wise steward by tracking your money, how much is coming in, how much is going out. And you do that weekly. Don't do that monthly or never, or just look at your bank account balance, say, oh, I've got money, I'm good. Because that doesn't work either, right? Because whatever you pay attention towards will expand and grow. Whatever you ignore leaves you. So for example, I had a client that she was too busy to track her money, right? She was a business owner, very ADHD, like a lot of business owners are. And as she was going through life, she's like, I'm just so busy, I got to keep making money. I'm like, why don't we slow down a bit? What if we can improve your cash flow now? So we looked at it, and there were some things that we found. But what's interesting, though, is just by her watching her money, she became better a steward of it. And so she actually freed up $1,800 a month. That's $22,000 a year without sacrificing lifestyle. It wasn't like she had to, necessarily like stop spending money, stop enjoying life. She just became more responsible with it. She just stopped just spending it, because it's like Parkinson's law. Whenever you have an increase of time or money, you blow it, right? And just like 2020, we all had enough time for a while that we were able to do martial arts and things like that, and Netflix binge on Tiger King and things like that. But now we're like, dang, we're busy. Where did all that time go? Parkinson's law, right? We fill it. Same thing with money. So you got to make sure you give every dollar a job. So that's the get lean part. It doesn't mean get cheap. It doesn't mean live on rice and beans. It just means be a wise steward. Get liquid, this is very different than what you hear from financial advisors too. Because get liquid means you get your money out of prison. You don't lock it up in those 401ks and IRAs. You don't lock it up by trying to pay off your house early and have all this equity there. You instead get that money in your possession. So then you can do the third thing, which is now get that money out into investments that do pay predictable passive income. And so, for example, I had one client that, of course, some of my best scarcity savers, the best disciplined savers even, are my Asian clients. I have a lot of them, and especially in California, right? And this guy was no exception. He was out in San Diego, and he's like, Chris, I've got a plan. He was in his 40s at the time. He says, Chris, I'm going to pay off both my house mortgage and my rental property mortgage, and I pay those both off. And then when they're debt free, I'll have a lot of money. I was like, well, good. Well, how much money do we actually free up by paying your mortgages? We found out it would free up about $4,200 a month, or about $50,000 a year. It's like, cool, not bad. I was like, so you do that for the next 6 years, you can free up that $4,200 a month. I said, but I noticed when I looked at your full picture here, right? When I'm looking at your net worth, as we were talking about earlier, I was like, I noticed that you've got your own home that's got a lot of equity because you're trying to pay it off, but you also got this rental property. how much is this rental property paying you net cash flow every month? He says, net profit is about $200 a month. I said, but there's $700,000 of equity here. What if we sold that property, pulled the equity, and then invested it? He's like, well, I don't know. Like, my wife and I really love that property. It was our first one. It's like, I get it. You're married to it somewhat, but we could do something with this. We can even do a cash out refinance of your own house and do some things too. Well, it took me 2 years to convince him. He finally just said, okay, my wife and I talked about it. We're going to sell that rental property finally. Luckily for him, the property appreciated. He had now $800,000 of equity, making $200 a month. Different from the other guy, but similar. Well, he sold that property, and then he did his own 1031 exchange to buy about 6 properties in Louisiana. So he moved away from California because everything on the western half of the U.S. sucks. He went to Louisiana, bought 6 properties. Now, those properties were paying him about $6,000 a month. So already, day one, he was making more in cash flow than he would have waiting 6 years to pay off those properties, right? Even that property will only paid him $2,400 a month. So he went from what could have been $2,400 a month in 6 years to now making $6,000 a month today. Well, now, just a few months ago, he reached out. He says, Chris, I want to just update you. I'm now well over $100,000 a year of passive income because I kept taking that money and reinvesting it. As I talk about compounding income versus compounding interest. Take that income, that passive income, reinvest it, so then your income does this. And so now he's over $100,000 a year. The very year he was supposed to be debt, quote unquote, debt free with those properties, guess what? He's now making, instead of $50,000 a year, over $100,000 a year with that money. That's the difference.
That's wonderful. That's amazing. And so what's the best way for people to connect with you, for you to be able to help them through the steps that you mentioned?
Anything that's Money Ripples, whether it's moneyripples.com, the Money Ripples podcast we have on all platforms, including YouTube, of course, at Money Ripples on social media. And then you can also find the Work Optional Blueprint book on Amazon.
That's excellent. Is there any last thing that you'd like to share with our listeners before we sign off?
Yeah, I'd say there's always hope, right? I think that's the biggest thing that keeps me doing what I'm doing every day, because for me, it's not just about becoming rich, right? Because trust me, I have a way easier life, not happier, but an easier life, just doing my own thing, living a quiet life, right? But I feel like with great power comes great responsibility. I feel like there's this ripple effect that we're all here to create, which is why I call the company Money Ripples. And so the big thing is, it's not just about creating your own comfort and convenience and your own freedom. I mean, sure, that helps, but it's also now, what can you do with those blessings? So I feel like as you're blessed with more stewardship, you now have the ability to bless more lives and create a ripple effect that can literally create a worldwide ripple effect through people's lives. And so I just say that there's always hope, more than what you probably think there is. It's just a matter of knowing that you got to shift the mindset, shift how you see the world, and you'll start to realize that truth will set you free.
Wow, what a powerful conversation. Thank you so very much for all of your shares and for being on with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much for being here.
As we wrap up, one of my favorite takeaways from this conversation with Chris Miles was his simple 3-step framework for building financial freedom. Get lean, get liquid, and get out. Get lean by becoming a better steward of your money. Get liquid by making sure your capital isn't locked away where you can't use it. And get out by putting that money to work in investments that generate real cash flow. If you'd like to learn more about Chris, you can find him at Money Ripples or check out his book, The Work Optional Blueprint. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Pending and Trending. I'm Deidre Quinn, and until next time, keep building wealth and creating a life where work becomes optional. If this episode was helpful, check out the next episodes of Pending and Trending for more real conversations around building wealth and financial freedom.